Well, welcome back, everyone, to our study of the Psalms. Tonight we'll be in Psalm 86 once again. But first, a quick review of verses 1 and 2 from last week. Beginning with verse 1, remember it says, "Incline your ear, O Lord, and answer me, for I am afflicted and needy." Again, it's this picture of David requesting that God stretch his ear down to him, to bend over to him, put his ear down close to his mouth, so that David can submit his request. And when he says, "Answer me," that's not a command in any way, shape, or form. That is a desperate cry, a desperate plea for the Lord to listen and to provide an answer to him in his distress. And we know that because the next things he says is, "For I am afflicted and needy." Afflicted and needy being in spirit, saying, "Look, my soul has been brought low. Lord, my soul is in a condition of to where it is spiritually poor. I am spiritually poor, and I desperately need you and you only." In verse 2, "Preserve my soul, for I am a godly man." We know that David's in fear for his life. He says he's a godly man, but we know that the only godliness that David ever ascribed to himself was that which he assigned through his relationship with God, that imputed righteousness that comes to us through by and only by our relationship with the Lord. He said, "O you, my God, save your servant who trusts in you." I'm putting all of my eggs in one basket, Lord. I'm putting all my faith, all my hope, all my trust in you, not in myself, not in any plans of my own, not in other people, not in any worldly ways. I'm coming to you and you alone. I'm putting my faith in you and you alone. So picking up in verse 3 tonight. "Be gracious to me, O Lord, for to you I cry all day long." David begins again by asking God for grace. It's a request for mercy and pity. It's the cry of a man that has no resources in which to help himself. And he says, "Be gracious to me, O Lord." And where our text reads Lord, what David actually called God was Adonai, which is to say, Master. And David refers to God in this psalm by two of his names. He refers to God by his proper name, which is Yahweh, and then, as in verse 1, and then 7 times in this psalm, he refers to God as Adonai. That's significant because that is God's name that is best translated as Master. Or when you refer to God as Adonai, you're speaking to God as from the perspective of a slave speaking to his master. And it's important, for one thing, to see David recognize God as his master, as should all who belong to him, but it also shows a level of dependency as well. David is here, the servant, begging his master for grace. And then he adds, "For to you I cry all day long." David doesn't look for the answers that he needs within himself. He doesn't look to other people. He doesn't look anywhere except to God. And it's also important to note that he cries out to God, to his master, all day long. This isn't a one prayer and he's done. He gets into prayer with the Lord and he stays in that prayer. I would ask you to consider your own prayer life. How consistent is your prayer life? How much do you pray? And I don't think that prayer length is nearly as important as simply praying very frequently and consistently. But prayer through long periods of time, that can be a great experience with God as well. Consider the teaching of Jesus from Luke chapter 18, verses 1 through 8. Kind of lengthy passage, but bear with me. "Now Jesus was telling them a parable to show that at all times they ought to pray and not to lose heart, saying, In a certain city There was a judge who did not fear God and did not respect man. There was a widow in that city, and she kept coming to him, saying, "Give me legal protection from my opponent." For a while he was unwilling, but afterward he said to himself, "Even though I do not fear God nor respect man, yet because this widow bothers me, I will give her legal protection. Otherwise, by continually coming, she will wear me out." And the Lord said, "Hear what the unrighteous judge said. Now, will not God bring about justice for his elect who cry to him day and night? And will he delay long over them? I tell you that he will bring about justice for them quickly. However, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth?" A lot of teaching points here, but we're not going to hit all of those. Zero in on these, though. Jesus is asking the question, when I return to this earth someday, will I find people who are continually crying out to me in prayer? And he's contrasting the unrighteous judge with himself, the righteous judge. He's saying if the unrighteous judge will help you just to shut you up, what do you think the righteous judge will do for those whom he loves? David is crying out all day long to a righteous judge in Adonai, his God, his Lord and Master. Are you crying out to God that way? Then verse 4, "Make glad the soul of your servant, for to you, O Lord, I lift up my soul." Now, David's prayers, they're all so very well thought out, and they're also very well worded. Not only does David here cry out to God to come to his rescue, as many often do, he also cries out to God to make glad the soul of your servant. So often people only cry out to God in times of trouble, believing that the only thing standing between them and their happiness is whatever that thing is in their life that is causing them trouble. But this is a wrong way of thinking. True happiness, and the happiness that David seeks from God, let me say that again. True happiness, the happiness that David seeks from God, or is the happiness that David seeks from God. So David asked God to not only save him, but to make his soul glad. David has said, "I put my life in your hands, God, completely. If I'm to be blessed, it has to come from you. Anything else is a cheap counterfeit. Any happiness is temporary at best and ultimately unfulfilling." Verse 5, "For you, Lord, are good and ready to forgive and abundant in loving kindness to all who call upon you." Now that verse 5, it is a mouthful. Let's get into it. "For you, Lord," again, here it is, Master, Adonai, "are good." Now, if there is a truth about God that we must hold on to with all of our might and never let go, it is this truth that God is good. And being good, he is never not good. To doubt that is to open a Pandora's box of false theology. Because God is good, I can trust him with my life. Because God is good, I can obey without doubting that whatever happens is the best thing that could happen for me, even if the world sees what is happening to me as a tragedy. But not only is God our master, not only is God our master good, he's also, David says next, ready to forgive. And so difficult is this to wrap our thinking around, the idea of God being ready to forgive. What does that mean, really? Well, think of the context that we most frequently say or think, "I'm ready." When I worked in the corporate world, the most frequent use of "I'm ready" was, "I'm ready for the weekend." My father-in-law's most frequent use of "I'm ready" is, "I'm ready for a vacation." Another very popular one among others. My very own would be, I'm ready to eat. In all of these instances, being ready truly means waiting with anticipation. There is an excitement that leads up to something that is pleasurable. That's what David says about God's feelings regarding forgiveness. God is excited about forgiving. He anticipates forgiveness, and he made the only way that we can even have forgiveness. Isn't it wonderful that God is ready to forgive us? Just ready and waiting. We don't have to warm him up first. We don't have to get things right in our life first, as so many people presuppose and wrongly assume. So what do we need to do? Well, there's only two things truly that we need to do. Number one, realize that I need to be forgiven. In other words, realize that I am a sinner. And two, go to God and God alone for forgiveness, recognizing that he is the only one that can provide for me what I need. And as if these things aren't wonderful enough, David adds more. So he says, God is good, but he's ready to forgive. And then he says, and abundant in loving kindness, which helps people with their next question. They say, Wes, you say that God is good. Well, how good is he? You say that he's ready to forgive. Well, how much is he ready to forgive? Are there limitations? Because you see, in our humanity, we are nothing like God. We think nothing like him, and we behave nothing like him. We might do a good deed only to follow it up with an evil deed. Even we who belong to the Lord are torn between the Spirit's desire and our own desires. The war between good and evil is constantly playing a tug of war inside the heart of mankind. Not so with God, nor has it ever been. Good has the victory in the heart of God 100% of the time for all eternity. How good is God? God is better than you could ever imagine. And that's good news for us, church. And forgiveness to us also is nothing like it is to God. We can and do forgive, but we like to set conditions sometimes on our forgiveness, don't we? And we like to set limitations upon it. We can make it really hard on people at times, and we like to bring up things that we supposedly forgave in the future, or if it suits our purposes. But God's forgiveness is as profound. God's forgiveness is as profound as his goodness, which is why David says God is abundant in loving kindness. He is always in plentiful supply. We say, then if all these things are true, then why is there a hell? Why isn't everyone saved? And the answer lies in the last part of verse 5. Let's look at the whole of it once more. So verse 5 in its entirety says this: For you, Lord, are good and ready to forgive and abundant in loving kindness to all who call upon you. The opportunity, you see there, church, the opportunity is there for everyone to experience God's goodness, for everyone to receive his perfect forgiveness that knows no limits. So why don't all have it? Because God will not force us to have it. He gives us opportunity, and David says he gives that opportunity to all, and that's the good news because that includes you and me. We are included in all, and so is everyone else. There's no discrimination with God, but we must call upon him. And to call upon God, these are the things we must do. We must humble ourselves, like David in verse 1. We must seek his righteousness, like David in verse 2. We must cry out for grace and mercy, like David in verse 3. We must recognize that God is good and I am not, like David in verse 5. Or I skipped one. We must seek God's plan for happiness, like David in verse 4. We must recognize forgiveness comes from God, like David does in verse 5. And we must recognize that God saves all who truly come to him, like David recognizes in verse 5. Consider the alternatives. Let's flop those. And a false belief system. A false belief system says this. If I, instead of humbling myself, I don't humble myself, but I think very highly of myself. Not seeking his righteousness, but creating my own system of righteousness. And that most often is a works-based system. If I do enough good, outnumbers the bad, I crown myself saved. The Bible teaches nothing of the sort. It actually teaches the exact opposite. Not crying out for grace and mercy. And I wouldn't do that because I'm good enough as I am. Why would I bother crying out for grace and mercy when I don't need it? Not seeking God's plan for happiness, but defining happiness the way the world does and then seeking it by the world's standards. Not believing that I can be good through God, but believing that I have the ability to be good on my own. Not recognizing that I need God to be forgiven, but believing that I have the ability to make up for the wrongs that I've done. Not recognizing that I must call upon God to save me, but believing that God must save me because, after all, I'm a good person, and why wouldn't he save me? People with false theologies like this basically are daring God not to save them. And it all comes from an ignorance of who God is and what his word says. Theology that is infused with worldly thinking leads us straight to hell. But the good news is that good theology is not hard to find if we but look to the book. Next week we'll pick up in verse 6, but until then, love God and love others. I'm Wes LaFleur, signing off.